Okay, great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Patrick. It's good to see you again and good to be here with this particular audience. As Patrick mentioned, I've been pretty active in this area of sensors, body integrated sensors, for a number of years. And I noticed that there's sort of an industrial flavor and company speakers associated with this meeting. So I decided to kind of focus on work that's been going on in our group that has translated and is in the form of widely deployed products, addressing various clinical needs and consumer sort of opportunities. And so it's kind of a blend between sort of academic and translational or startup related activities, hopefully of interest to this audience. And so everything that I'll talk about involves some form of wireless communication between soft skin integrated sensors and the human body. And it's really driven by our interest in seeing what we can do in terms of technology advancements that could impact patient care ultimately, and give you a sense of areas of activity that we've been pursuing over the last 10 years or so. So it's a lot of slides. I'm going to go pretty quickly. It's kind of an overview, just touch on a number of different things that we're interested in, things that we've done recently, things that represent ongoing work, and then hopefully that'll stimulate conversations during lunch. If you want to know more about any of these topics, happy to share details, but this will be pretty much an overview. So I'll start with the background and give you a sense of the materials foundations. My core expertise is in electronic materials science and engineering. I think most of you guys are probably electrical or computer engineers. We do a little bit of that ourselves, but that's not the key sort of differentiating aspect of what I'll share with you today. But there are all kinds of opportunities in driving further advances through unique circuit architectures and component level designs. But everything is highly interdisciplinary because we're interested in translation, so we can't just work on the materials. We have to think about the devices and the systems and the chemistry and all the rest of it. And with a strong interface to the medical community. So I have an appointment in neurological surgery and dermatology where I have deep sets of collaborations across faculty associated with our medical school, but the broader medical complex in Chicago, as you'll see as I step through the various slides in this talk. So the technology is sort of split out into two categories, the first of which involves sensors that operate based on electronic principles and designed to measure biophysical parameters associated with health status. And in the latter part of the talk, I'll discuss similar kinds of skin compatible, or what we refer to as epidermal device technologies, specifically those that involve microfluidic capabilities, and wireless based on digital image capture, colorimetric chemical reagents to capture biochemical, biomarker indicators of health. And I should mention that there's tremendous work happening here. Patrick and Joe Wong and Sheng Xu, and a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is just related to our work, but I just want to acknowledge that there's a broader community doing great work in this area. So everything that we do is funded by an endowed institute that allows us to do translational level activity, almost as an incubator, I guess is one way you could think about it. So we can develop not only innovative sensors, publish those, but we can also scale them up and do in-house manufacturing with levels of quality control that allow us to do pilot scale studies on human subjects at meaningful statistical levels through our engagements with the medical community. And so this is a really powerful vehicle for driving things beyond what we could otherwise afford to support with the usual federal sources of academic research support. So the overarching idea around this Institute for Bioelectronics, so sort of biocompatible electronics, or more generally biocompatible microsystems technologies is what we think about. And so it's useful to sort of take a step back and ask, what are the key engineering features of the most successful sorts of man-made micro and nanosystems technologies, maybe represented by integrated circuits, microfluidic chips, but also microelectromechanical systems, optoelectronic, photonic systems as well. Very sophisticated, obviously, extremely well-developed technologies, cost-effectively produced in very sophisticated manufacturing facilities. But if you take a look at the overarching engineering principles, they're basically built on planar, rigid substrates, typically semiconductor wafers, plates of glass. And in terms of the overall architecture, they exist in relatively dense overall 2D multi-layer constructs, much different than what you would see in biology. And it's good to think about that if you want to develop biocompatible forms of microsystems technologies, to take a look at the engineering approaches that evolution has arrived at. And they're much different. So if you think about, the equivalent to an integrated circuit, maybe a neural circuit in the brain, for example, or microfluidic system in the body consists of maybe a vascular network in the brain. Much different in terms of the architectures. They're curved, they're compliant, it's soft materials integrated with hard materials, primarily where the functional elements exist in 3D open frameworks. And so that sort of sets the stage for a number of engineering challenges to try to adapt and not mimic these kinds of features, but at least bring man-made systems closer to those the kinds of features you see in biology to enable a persistent, non-invasive interface between technology and biology. And so from a materials science standpoint, again, it's not a materials talk, we just try to step you through different platforms that we've been able to push out of the lab. But from an overarching design approach, we've sort of tried to blend hard and soft materials together to allow us to leverage the very best of what exists in conventional man-made systems with overall physical properties that are aligned with soft tissues of the human body. And so we do that by building composite structures, or deterministic composites, where we use silicon or other kinds of inorganic semiconductor materials in nanoscale forms. And then we integrate them with soft elastomers in various kinds of architectures that afford sort of a soft, low Young's modulus, effective sets of mechanical properties, even though these deterministic composites include high modulus brittle materials like silicon. So you can leverage silicon for the electronic functionality and the silicone elastomer matrix as a biocompatible physical interface to tissues. So from a design standpoint, then you think not only about circuit layouts as you ordinarily would, but you have to think about the material selections and the mechanics designs as well to build these multi-material, heterogeneously integrated systems. So you think about things in a little bit different way, and you couple all of these considerations together to achieve the kinds of electronic performance characteristics you ultimately need, but in platforms that, again, are sort of compatible with the human body. And I'll focus on skin in this presentation because it represents sort of the most near-term opportunity for these ideas, although a lot of the same concepts would apply to implantable devices as well. And we work a lot in that space, but more kind of at an academic level without crisp examples of translational successes, so I won't focus on that. So you can think about this from a material science standpoint as a hard-soft hybrid composite material structure that just so happens to be configured to support the electronic functionality you ultimately need. So we've been working in this space for a while. I think we sort of had this idea of a skin-like electronic platform, again, this sort of epidermal electronic concept, maybe 2009, 2010, published in 2011. I won't go through the details. Basically, all the physical properties pretty well matched to the epidermis, but again, embedding silicon and copper and silicon dioxide, all the most well-developed electronic materials, but in these kind of open, kind of network type geometries embedded in elastomers to give you skin-like physical characteristics. So we thought we kind of figured it out in 2011, got a little bit better in 2014, and then begin to build, along with a broader community doing great work in this area, different specific systems designed to address specific unmet needs in patient care, and thinking about medical grade monitoring capabilities. So sensors that can reproduce the kinds of monitoring systems that are present in an intensive care unit, for example, but without the wires, without the cost, without the constraints associated with use only in laboratory or hospital settings, but in devices that could operate wirelessly at a relevant point in the anatomy to track physical characteristics of health status continuously in normal daily routine in a home setting. So that's been the idea. We've been developing a wide variety of technologies that have those characteristics. You can think about the sensors. What kinds of measurement capabilities can you contemplate in this kind of epidermal electronic system? And many groups have contributed to this overall space and this overall portfolio of sensors. The ones that we're most familiar with and have worked mostly on involve thermal characteristics. So not only skin temperature, obviously, but mapping variations in skin temperature with high spatial and temporal resolution, but measuring not just temperature, but actually thermal transport characteristics. I'll get back to that in a little bit. So thermal conductivity, thermal diffusivity, heat capacity of the skin and other kinds of tissue systems. You can measure hydration, electrical, obvious opportunity there, electrocardiograms, electromyograms, electroencephalograms, and so on. You can also use electrical measurements to determine hydration, bioimpedance, for example. The second part of this talk, I'll focus on this idea of microfluidic skin-like devices. You can combine those with electronics, or you can operate them without the electronics. I'll show you how to do that. Where our focus has been on eccrine sweat. As an interesting but relatively underexplored class of biofluid that's attractive to us because of its ability to be captured non-invasively. But you can also measure blood flow, mechanical characteristics, strain, motion, modulus pressure, accelerometers, strain gauges, that type of thing. Optical, obviously, you can measure environmental characteristics of sunlight, for example, but you can do oximetry, photoplethysmography, vein mapping. You can measure body sounds as well, cardiac auscultation, lung sounds, for example. And then you can mix and match these sensors as needed into an individual platform to create multimodal levels of functionality. And then you can mount multiple devices at different body locations, all wirelessly time synchronized to get kind of full body assessments beyond what might be possible just through measurement at a single location. Now, most of what we do where there is a clinical predicate, we aim for clinical quality in the data streams so that physicians can interpret the data and act upon the data. But to do that not only in a hospital laboratory setting, but as I mentioned before, continuously in a home setting. And as I'll mention, we're interested in cost as an additional engineering design constraint because we're focused on translation so that this technology could be available not only to people in the developed world, but also in lower middle income countries. I'll give you some examples of work in that direction as well. So if you can do all of that, what class of patient would benefit most strongly for that technology? And we decided pretty early on, maybe premature babies would be a good focus because they're currently monitored with really a terrible engineering solution. They have to be monitored 24/7 because they're a very fragile health status, all vital signs all the time. Typically done with things like this, very costly, very invasive, many reasons why this is a terrible solution. I won't go through that. But the idea that we had probably around 2015 or so is to try to figure out how to get rid of all of this stuff and replace it with 2 or 3 of these skin-like wireless patches without any sacrifices in data quality or data breadth. Is the goal. So I won't go through the details. It turns out you can do all of that. It's pretty heavy lift from a materials and electrical engineering and regulatory standpoint, all this kind of stuff. But you can do it. We published it in spring 2019. 2 patches, one that goes on the chest, one that goes on a limb, either the hand or the foot, and you can reproduce everything that's done, even a level 4 NICU in terms of monitoring of health status. So we did about 200 babies exploiting this institute that we have that allows us to scale up technologies to meaningful levels all the way down to gestational age, about 26 weeks, 24 weeks is the edge of viability. So all the way down to the very smallest babies that you would encounter in a NICU, and doing it all under IRB approval where we're also simultaneously capturing all of the same data streams using clinical standards. So it's a chest unit, but then we're also doing EEG at the same time for validation. So that's all hardware, but if you're wanting to get things into an operating NICU onto actual patients, the nurses have to be able to interact with it. So we had to develop graphical user interface as well that replicates what they're used to seeing on the Philips or GE Dash systems in terms of heart rate and blood oxygenation, temperature, and so on. So we did about 200 to validate it. That worked pretty well in the NICU. We expanded then into the PICU, pediatric intensive care unit, a little bit bigger babies, but still benefiting from wireless solutions. There's an example of a baby in this case. These devices would happen to be battery-free is the way we've designed them. So we're using magnetic inductive coupling, 13.56 megahertz, an antenna in the base of the chair or in the back of the chair can wirelessly couple power into these devices. And then we're using NFC SoC for data capture, digitization, and then wireless transfer of data back through that same magnetic inductive coupled link. And so the chest unit, the unit on the foot, these are time synchronized, so you get hemodynamic information. You can measure beat cycle up here through ECG. You measure PPG here. That determines the timing of when that pulse of blood arrives at the foot, for example, as you get pulse wave velocity. Some cases that can be used as a surrogate for blood pressure if it's calibrated appropriately. But anyway, another metric. And the chest unit is doing ECG, so you get heart rate variability, respiration rate. There's also a temperature sensor here. You get a pretty good estimation of core body temperature. And of course, it's 2-color PPG, so you get blood oxygenation out of that device. So that reproduces all the vital signs that are representing the standard of care. And of course, you want to benchmark and you want to look at the data quality and the dropouts and the accuracy and so on, and compare that to clinical standards. So these are the kinds of data streams that come out. There's actually an additional data trace here. It's two-color PPG, ECG. These two traces are associated with a high bandwidth accelerometer, so we can measure motions of the chest wall cavity, but also capture cardiac sounds in that way. So seismocardiograms here. This is non-standard. This is not typical of standard of care in a NICU, but it's easy to add that additional functionality with this idea of multimodality, which I mentioned before, so you can actually capture additional data. But the standards are things that physicians look like, neonatal nurse, for example, heart rate, SpO2, respiration rate, and temperature, and all that works pretty well. And we publish that in Nature Medicine. I would say if your aim is to do something that's medically relevant, it's really important to engage with the clinical community to understand the constraints on how the devices operate, how accurate they need to be, and so on. So this is the sort of thing that we strive to do with these sorts of efforts. So the highly interdisciplinary across various areas of engineering science, but also building in the medical community as well. So the head of dermatology, head of neonatology, and head of pediatrics, all co-authors here. And then the usual cohorts of grad students, postdocs, and so on. But the nurses turn out to be the most important people from a practical standpoint, because they understand what really works, what the devices need to look like, how they need to interface with the babies. All this kind of stuff needs to go into your engineering choices of how to build the technology if you want it to really be useful. And so we try to do that as best we can. So that was 2019. We were approached shortly thereafter by the Gates Foundation, Save the Children organization, asking if we could configure those kinds of devices with a cost structure that would allow them to be deployed into lower and middle income countries in an economically viable way. And that set up a whole separate stream of engineering work, trying to wring out all the costs associated with those devices. And I can go through the details of what we did there, but we were able to get to an endpoint. So this is our first deployment. This was into Zambia, late 2019, partnership with the Gates Foundation, Save the Children organization, a couple of my students up here training healthcare workers in Zambia. And since then, we've expanded beyond Zambia to Kenya, Ghana, India, Pakistan, Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. So 20 countries at this point, and it's at this stage, you got to move it out of the academic lab. You can't really support that scale of deployment, 20 countries, about 250,000 hours of data collected. So still in the early stages, I would say, but it seems like it's headed in the right direction. So we'll see how that goes. Lots of ways these things can fail, but I'm pretty happy with where we are right now, and multiple FDA clearances around that technology as well. I'll get back to latest activity in that direction in a second. So the idea is you start with reproducing the standard of clinical care. If you can't do that, you're not even in the conversation. So you have to do that first, and then you can think about novel metrics that you could layer on top of your devices to sort of expand the portfolio of information that's used to make healthcare decisions. And so, for example, that high bandwidth accelerometer can be used to determine the orientation of these babies, their activity levels. In particular, it allows you to track when those babies are engaged in something called kangaroo mother care. And this is something that's really encouraged in lower and middle income countries where there's a lack of incubators. It's really that skin-to-skin contact between the mother and child that's known to have a strong beneficial effect on the health of the baby. And so being able to track how often that kangaroo mother care is occurring turns out to be very important. And you can also track the impact of KMC on various vital signs. You see the SpO2 tends to go up, at least in this particular case, when the baby was engaged in this KMC. You can also capture vocal biomarkers, so it's a high bandwidth accelerometer. It's not a microphone, so you're not affected by ambient noises. You're basically measuring vibratory signatures of vocalization through motions of the surface of the chest. And so maybe there's information, these vocal biomarkers associated with crying, time, tonality, other things. It's just data that comes for free. And it's interesting to think about how that might be used in the future with machine learning algorithms and so on. And so that's something that we're thinking about. So you have to sort of start, as I mentioned before, this is what I believe anyway, start with clinical standard of care, replace that, and then add to it is the best way to get started. And so I'll give you an example of a measurement modality that doesn't exist at all, enabled by skin interface devices to address an urgent need in patient care, and specifically for pediatric patients that suffer from hydrocephalus. in those patients, they insert a shunt into the ventricles of the brain, and those shunts oftentimes clog up, and their patency needs to be evaluated. So that'll be an example of de novo, but let me just tell you one more thing, which is sort of a natural extension of neonatal care, which is sort of go back and think about maternal and fetal care, because a lot of times that determines the health of the newborn. And so we can take those same kinds of devices I just described to you, deployed on the neonates, and adapt them for monitoring the health of the mother. So we're doing the same sort of full vital sign monitoring of the health of the mother, but then we add a third device to monitor uterine contractions and fetal heart rate. And so all of these are time synchronized now, and reproducing the same kinds of measurements that are done at Prentice Women's Hospital, where we have collaborations. And so again, sort of do the validation, show that you have the same accuracy as clinical standards. In some cases, actually better, because you eliminate a lot of the noise artifacts associated with the wires that are used in those traditional systems. And also you wring out a lot of the costs, as I mentioned before, in terms of the Gates program. But I won't go through the details. Basically, you validate it that way. But you're measuring more than you ordinarily would, in an intrapartum setting, even in a hospital like Prentice Women's, because you get things like positionality. So you can correlate the orientation of the mother's body during the birth process with birth outcomes, and start to begin to look for correlations there to lead to better insights for improved care of patients. So the idea is you're eventually not just looking at a single patient, but you would like to capture population scale data, apply machine learning to get insights into likely health trajectories. So measure when a problem is likely to occur before it actually occurs. I mean, that's kind of the aspiration. But now you have a single data collection platform. You can capture data in common formats and begin to think about that. So this is a study that we completed in summer of 2021, almost 500 pregnant women in Zambia. And so this is illustrating the trajectories in terms of heart rate, respiration rate, systolic blood pressure, inferred from that pulse wave velocity, as I mentioned before, and SpO2. And you begin to see trends and so on. Now, this is not enough to really make meaningful predictive assessments, because, well, tragically, 3 of these 487 pregnant women died during childbirth. So we have all of the data leading all the way up to the point of death, but it's not enough, examples of that to make meaningful inferences. But if you multiply that by a factor of 10, factor of 100, then you can begin to think seriously about that kind of possibility. And that's what's really driving the current program that we have. We just launched or announced just earlier this week, just almost a $20 million grant to Cybele Health, is the spin-out company that's driving this stuff at this point, to look at maternal health specifically, because of the high death rates that are associated with childbirth in LMICs. And so that's just gotten started, and it was just announced this week. So let me come back to hydrocephalus. I got ahead of myself a little bit and talk about that de novo capability. So going beyond what's done today. So hydrocephalus can be congenital, so it could be a genetic disorder, or could be brought on by traumatic brain injury. As I mentioned before, it's characterized by overproduction of cerebrospinal fluid in the intracranial space, and it's currently treated. There's no medicine that will treat this, so it's treated with a device solution. It's basically a tube that inserts into the ventricles of the brain. There's a check valve, and then it terminates at a distal location, typically the abdomen. So as the pressure builds up, cerebrospinal fluid can flow through this tube, relieve the pressure in the intracranial space, which would otherwise be a life-threatening condition. And so that works to a large extent. The problem is, especially with pediatric patients, these shunts have almost 100% failure rate after 5 years due to kinking or obstruction, protein buildup, for example, rupture. And the issue with that is that when the shunt fails, it leads to nonspecific symptoms. So you develop a headache, or you begin to feel nauseous. And so if you have hydrocephalus, you have a shunt, you begin to have a headache, you have to go to the hospital. Because if it is a blocked shunt, it could be life-threatening condition. But a lot of times it's not a blocked shunt, you just have a headache. I mean, people get headaches. And so it's a big problem. And for many of these patients, it requires frequent and repetitive trips to the hospital every time they feel nauseous, have a headache, and exposes them to radiation through CT scans, trying to figure out if the shunt is blocked or not, in some cases surgical interventions as well. And so we were approached by neurological surgeons at Northwestern Memorial Hospital about this need because they were aware of the fact that we were developing flow monitoring devices that use very simple ideas in thermal dilution. So I mentioned that we can measure temperature to very high precision because these devices are not thermally loading the surface of the skin because they're skin-like characteristics. The thermal mass is very small. So you're measuring real physiological changes in temperature at the surface of the skin. You can do that very precisely, 0.01 degrees or so. In precision, not accuracy, but in precision, you measure changes on that level. And so what you can do in order to measure flow is you develop a constellation of those high sensitivity pressure sensors surrounding a thermal actuator, so a little heater element here. You inject a little bit of thermal power into this region of the device, which is coupled to the underlying skin. And if it's aligned with a blood vessel, what will happen is you induce a couple of degrees temperature increase at that location, and then thermal diffusion will create an asymmetry in the resulting temperature distribution, skewed in the downstream direction due to the effects of blood flow. So you end up with something like this. If blood flow is in this direction, it's very intuitive to expect that this would happen. So this is temperature. It's highest at the point of the thermal actuator, but then skewed in the downstream direction. And you can use modeling to extract out from the magnitude of that asymmetry in the thermal distribution the volumetric flow rate. And so he presented this at the Grand Rounds seminar in neurological surgery, and a lot of the surgeons came up and asked whether we could use that blood flow monitoring technology to monitor flow of cerebrospinal fluid through shunts, which I had no idea about. So we actually work with NIH to show that this kind of thermal dilution approach is accurate in the flow measurement by comparing it to laser Doppler techniques, which can also be used, but quite confounded with motion artifacts and speckle and things like that. So we're able to work with the surgeon to demonstrate this device in patients that were undergoing surgeries to repair their shunts. So in this case, we have the distal end of the shunt exposed, so we can actually measure directly the flow rate of cerebrospinal fluid coming through that shunt, and then at the same time, we can measure that flow with our device applied to the surface of the skin at a location where the shunt is near the skin surface. And so that works really well. If you want to just determine flow or no flow, it's a very straightforward measurement. If you want to determine the actual volumetric flow rate, then you need to know the thermal properties and the geometrical characteristics of the shunt, how deep it is under the skin. You can kind of do all that, but it builds in some uncertainties. But in many cases, you just want to know, is the shunt working or not? Turns out to be the most important clinical diagnostic as a first product opportunity. So we published this in 2018, got lots of emails from parents of kids with hydrocephalus wanting access to the technology, and that was really the motivating factor in starting a company to build that kind of technology into an FDA-approved tool that could be used initially in a hospital setting, but then into the future, thinking about it as a home diagnostic as well. And so we put together this company funded by the Steele Foundation for Hope and NIH grants pretty much, a little bit of venture capital investment, but this is not a multi-billion-dollar market, so the money guys are not super excited about it, but we're excited about it because it addresses an important patient need and will really improve the lives of those patients. So that's what we've done. So it's a de novo breakthrough designation from the FDA, and we just completed the pilot studies or the clinical studies needed to support that FDA submission in December. All the paperwork is in, and the data look great. And so I expect to get FDA approval, or we expect to get an FDA approval in the June timeframe. So anyway, it's mostly kids, and this is what it looks like. I think there's 7 clinical sites around the country that signed up to support these trials. So anyway, that's what it looks like. Let me tell you about a couple of other things. So a lot of our work is focused on early life health challenges and what we can do from an engineering standpoint to improve patient outcomes at that end of the age spectrum. But there are a lot of health challenges at the other in end of life health challenges. So stroke, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, this kind of thing. Very active in that space as well. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing there. So we were approached by rehabilitation specialists associated with our Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. It's the #1 ranked rehabilitation hospital in the U.S. And they specifically were interested in stroke survivors who suffer from dysphagia and aphasia. So these are people who, by a result of their stroke, have lost the ability to swallow and speak. They have to relearn how to do that. And what they do is they come into the rehabilitation clinic, they go through various protocols, exercises, and so on. In a lot of cases, the patients show great improvement while they're in the clinic. They go home and a lot of those improvements dissipate. And so we were asked whether we could develop a soft wireless sensor that would allow them to track swallowing behaviors and speech patterns continuously during the day in a home setting. And that turned out to be kind of an interesting challenge, and we ended up collaborating with folks at the Ability Lab to do that. And so the device itself is a high bandwidth accelerometer, wireless. It's built-in memory and other things here, battery powered in this case. Designed to mount on an interesting part of the anatomy known as the suprasternal notch. It's a soft tissue location at the base of the neck as a way to capture motion characteristics associated with swallowing, but also those vibratory signatures of speech. And the idea with speech is you can monitor speech of the individuals wearing the device without capturing the conversations that are happening around them. The other thing is it's not a microscope, so you're not capturing interpretable speech, which turns out to be very important. Very few people want all of their conversations recorded every day, and so there's sort of privacy concern that's naturally addressed by this sort of approach. But what we found is, mounting the device at this location makes a lot of sense for vocalization and swallowing, but it turns out you're close enough to the carotid artery, you can actually pick up motion signals associated with pulsatile blood flow through the carotid. And so from that, you can determine heart rate and heart rate variability, get it for free, essentially. You're also coupled to the chest wall, so you can measure cycles of respiration. You get respiratory sounds as well, because you can measure wheezing, coughing, that kind of thing. You're coupled to the core body, so you get body orientation, motion, physical activity. So it's a real information-rich location on the body. You might ask, if you have one device, you put it one place on the body, where would you locate it to get the maximum amount of information? I don't know if there's a unique answer to that question, but this is a pretty good spot because you get all of this stuff. Just with a mechanical interface to the body as well, no optical or electrical interface needed. So there's a lot of simplicity there as well. So what does the data look like? Here's what it looks like. So again, it's just triaxis accelerometry, wide bandwidth measurement. You're getting a three-axis signal. This is the Z. This is out of plane toward the surface normal of the skin. There are the respiratory cycles. You can see that. Here's some different activities: talking, swallowing, walking, jumping, that kind of thing. So all of these activities are overlaid on single time series data, but they have unique spectral and temporal characteristics that allow you to separate them to a very, very good degree, actually. So cardiac activity looks like this, be typical, lub-dub, that's just the S1, S2 sounds associated with the valve closings. This is talking. You have very harmonic oscillations with higher harmonic components, very different than cardiac activity. There's a swallow, so like a direct delta function like feature, and then walking, the magnitudes are way different, and the temporal characteristics are different as well. So you can develop just a very straightforward set of digital filters to basically separate out all those activities. I won't go into the details here, but you can get energy expenditure, heart rate, respiratory rate, swallow count, talk time, that kind of thing. And then you can compare to standard measurements of those types of parameters, and it works pretty well. I'll give you some examples in sleep monitoring, but let me go back to dysphagia. So monitoring talk time is very important for patients who suffer from aphasia. Dysphagia is different. It's the inability to swallow. And that turns out to be a little bit more nuanced. And so let me give you a sense of what that looks like. So this is a Parkinson's patient sitting in a chair wearing a device on the suprasternal notch. That's a raw data. Now, it looks really noisy. It's not noise. These high-frequency components, those are cardiac sounds. So you apply a bandpass filter to that data. You pull out all the cardiac information. You do peak finding. You get heart rate variability. You also get cardiac amplitude if you want to get deeper insight into cardiopulmonary health. But that's what it looks like. Then you can subtract out the cardiac component, and this is what you end up with. So now you can see the very smooth oscillations associated with cycles of respiration, inspiration, expiration, up, down, like that. And then these are the swallows. There's one, there's another one, there's another one, and so on. And so you can measure how often a patient is swallowing, what are the time characteristics of the gaps between adjacent swallows. You use that information to make sure the patients are swallowing frequently enough. That's important. But it turns out that the other important thing about swallows is they need to happen at the right time point on this respiratory phase. So it needs to happen at the peak of inspiration or the depth of expiration. If you swallow halfway in between, like we don't even think about it, but if you have a stroke, you have to relearn these things. If you swallow halfway in between, you can end up choking yourself. And so it becomes an extreme health hazard. So you need to know how frequently you're swallowing and whether you're swallowing at the right place in the respiratory phase. Now, the way that that's done in a rehab clinic is with hardware that looks like this. So it's a respiratory inductance plasmography band, goes around the chest. You monitor cycles of respiration there. And then there's a nasal cannula that goes up here. And evidently there's just a burst of airflow associated with each swallowing event. And you kind of imagine how that might work. So you count swallows here, you measure respiratory cycles here, but those are the sensors that connect over here to a box like that. So it's fine for laboratory rehab setting, hospital setting, but you can't do that continuously in the home setting. So that was the need, and that's the device that we developed. So this is it. And then we have a graphical user interface that provides real-time, graphical display of swallows and kind of what's going on. There we go. So this is bandpass filter data. So there are the respiratory cycles. And then we have automated algorithms identify the swallows, and they can just see, okay, that swallow is a little iffy. It's almost in that bad phase point, but the other two are okay. So that's what it looks like. They get trained. You can do remote rehab with this interface, connected to your rehab specialist, for example. But then there are cases where you don't want to have to constantly look at a screen to know what's going on. And so we build a haptic motor into this device, or you can have a haptic motor in a wristband wirelessly communicating with that device to alert the patient whether their swallows are appropriate, whether they're swallowing frequently enough, that type of thing. So these are kinds of things that you can do. The other thing that we looked at during the pandemic was deploying hundreds of these devices onto COVID patients, not only in the hospital, but after they were released back into the home. And so you can monitor standard vital signs, but you also get physical activity. But then the interesting metric here is non-standard one is you can measure cough. So you can measure, and that appears like a screaming signal, in the time series data. There's no problem finding the coughs. You can measure the intensity, the duration of the cough, whether it's a dry cough, a wet cough, just to add to the information that a physician can use to diagnose a patient. And so this example, just a representative COVID patient that we monitored in that way. Now, the other interesting thing is you're monitoring cough, you're monitoring heart rate, but you're also monitoring physical activity. And one of the things that was known in the early days of the pandemic is that one symptom of COVID is extreme fatigability. And so fatigue can be represented by increases in heart rate and respiratory rate correlated with increases in physical activity. And how great those changes are correlated can be used as a metric of fatigability. And so this particular study will be published soon and was done with Arun Jaramayan. And so looking at fatigability is another metric that goes beyond a traditional assessment that a physician might perform using standard tools. From a consumer standpoint, and maybe even from a medical standpoint, sleep is also interesting. There's lots of technologies to monitor sleep. Actigraphy would be a simple example of one, or an Apple Watch, but you're sitting on the wrist. It's hard to see how that's ever going to reproduce data that would be comparable to polysomnography. On the other hand, this device, I think, couples more in a more relevant way to parameters related to sleep than anything you could do with the wrist. That's my position anyway. And so you can capture a lot of this data and then develop machine learning algorithms, do sleep staging, and we're deep into that process. Done many patients through sleep labs, and you can compare quantitatively against PSG, respiration rate, heart rate, be a simple one. But you can also, again, you get body orientation during the night. And that's typically done in a sleep lab with video and then manual scoring of body orientation. But now you have a quantitative data stream related to that aspect of sleep that could be deployed in a home setting fairly well. And then this is machine learning algorithms doing sleep staging and comparing against manual expert marking of stages based on PSG. So anyway, this real-time body orientation turns out to be sort of interesting. So you can create sort of a avatar representation of body orientation during the sleep night and see how patients are moving around during the night. And then what's sort of interesting is then you can correlate various parameters related to sleep to body orientation. So for example, you can look at the cumulative distribution function of heart rate as a function of body orientation. And some people sleep more soundly on their left side versus right side, and you can do this on an individual basis driven by data from these devices. So, sort of interesting. The other thing you can capture beyond PSG is you can monitor when they're swallowing. I don't know if that's important, but you can track swallows during sleep. Maybe something additional that's sort of interesting. You can capture all sorts of snoring dynamics as well, all kinds of characteristics of different sorts of snores. So you can see how the snoring in this particular case, this is snoring signal, this sort of acoustic component here. There's the respiratory phase, so it's perfectly in line, as you might expect, with respiration, the snoring sounds. But then here, the patient just changed their body orientation a little bit, snoring went away. And so maybe you could use body orientation, haptics, and do some interesting things around guiding a patient during a sleep night in a minimally invasive way to avoid snoring and things like that. And you can pick up very early signs of snoring that difficult to detect with a microphone in the room. And so these sort of scarcely audible snoring signals maybe pick up snoring as it begins to develop, and then prompt a patient to rotate or change their body orientation to avoid the development of a snore, full-blown snore. So you can actually develop more sensitive measurements of body sounds, and this is the device we put together. So it still has the high IMU, but now we have a pair of microphones, one pointing in the ambient, one pointing toward the body, and then we have sound separation algorithms that allow us to separate ambient sounds from body sounds pretty well. We were approached with this need by neonatologists who are interested in GI disorders in newborns, and so you can mount multiple of these devices, listen to digestive sounds. You can measure lung sounds. We work with lung surgeons to sort of do like a 12-lead ECG equivalent of a lung diagnostic with multiple devices of this type, time synchronized for mapping and so on. Another thing you can do. So I'm coming up to the end of the talk. I probably have about five more minutes, and let me use that opportunity to shift the focus away from biophysical measurements, health status, that's characterizing everything I've talked to you about up to this point, to biochemical. And here we're initially interested in screening for cystic fibrosis, the gold standard of which involves an assessment of chloride concentration in sweat. I'll come back to that. But more generally, sweat, as I mentioned before, is a non-invasive, kind of interesting class of biofluid that might complement blood and interstitial fluid, provide an alternative to saliva, for example, for assessing health status. And there's a tremendous amount of great work happening here at UCSD, Joe Wong and Patrick and others. But our angle is maybe a little bit different, complementary to theirs, in the sense that we focus on two things. One is the idea of microfluidic lab on a chip in a skin-like format, so microfluidic technology. And instead of electrochemical approaches, we've developed chemical reagents and colorimetric schemes for measuring concentrations of biomarkers in platforms that would be single-use, disposable, recyclable, I guess, low cost is the idea. So this was our first stab at this, and it's basically a soft microfluidic system that can embed all of the kinds of features you would see in a traditional glass lab on a chip technology, but now because of the soft materials, skin compatible. So networks of channels, valves, reservoirs, inlet ports on the backside, and an otherwise closed microfluidic system that couples to the skin through a dual-sided biomedical bandage adhesive with holes cut to align with the inlet ports on the backside of the device. So it mounts on the surface of the skin. Eccrine glands then serve as the pumping source for pushing eccrine sweat up through those openings into the microfluidic system, through those inlets, and then through these various channels and valves and reservoirs for capture and analysis is kind of how it works. Now, you can include electrochemical sensing capabilities, but then you have to worry about batteries and radios and electronics and all that kind of stuff, which is great, and you can do that, and lots of people have done that, but we'd like to strip that out to keep the devices as simple as possible, and then just use the camera on the cell phone to capture images and do color extraction using these chemistries for quantitative determination of concentrations of biomarkers. That was the idea. So this is what it looks like, about the size of a quarter in this case. This is the first device, is just kind of an example. It's 5 inlet ports, one in the center, connects to this serpentine channel, runs around like that, has a color-changing chemistry that goes from purple to red when in contact with water. So you just identify the color change front, the angular position, the contour length, the cross-sectional dimensions, the size of the inlet determines sort of the sweat that's been captured from that region of the skin. And then the other 4 inlets connect individually to each of these 4 circular reservoirs that have different color-changing chemistries that respond to lactate, chloride, glucose, and pH. It's a very simple device, no electronics, and you read out a fair amount of information associated with sweat rate, sweat loss, sweat chemistry. Now the key is that it's got to be skin compatible. So you need to build these devices out of materials that are soft as the skin, because it's challenging to keep these devices adhered to the skin in the presence of what could be profuse sweating and vigorous motions and things in sort of an athletic context. But you can do all of that. Won't go through the details. It's more material science. But here's one mounted on the outer forearm of a grad student doing the work. You can see that central inlet has filled that serpentine channel up to this 7 o'clock position. You can determine from that the amount of sweat that's been lost from that region of the body. And then you can do a reasonable calibration of that local sweat loss to full body sweat loss. So you want to track hydration status associated with sweat loss. You can do that. And then those reservoirs have been filled, and you can do color extraction to determine. So this is kind of what it looks like, different device geometry, but just to give you a sense, it provides a real-time graphical representation of how much sweating is going on. This is on my forearm working out, begin to fill up the device, and got aggressive, tried to fill it up all the way to the end, almost killed myself to do that, but you can sort of fill it all the way here. And then you just take the images and you get the cumulative sweat loss as a function of exercise time. I was on an elliptical at this time, but it was amazing how constant the sweat rate was throughout that entire exercise period. But it was, constant intensity workout, so maybe that's not too surprising, but I don't think that's ever been measured before. And it's really easy to do with that type of device. Now, one of the color chemistries that turn out to be very powerful in this context, and I'll give you examples of commercial applications of this in a second, is measurement of chloride. So chloride is pretty well electrostatically balanced with sodium, so it's a good measurement of electrolyte level, and you're losing electrolytes as you sweat. And so if you're an athlete, you want to replenish electrolytes, you want to replenish lost water associated with sweating. And so chloride is a good measurement to make in that context. And you can develop an assay that changes in color from a very light purple to a very deep purple over a physiologically relevant range of concentrations of chloride in human sweat. That's the span right there. So you can do that pretty well. We publish it, and then we got a call from the president of Gatorade. He wanted to make a product out of that, pair it with Gatorade, drive additional sales of Gatorade, get them embedded in a web space and an app. You take a picture. There's the chloride channel. You get the electrolyte level, and then you get the amount of sweat loss over here. You use the app, and it tells you what kind of Gatorade to buy and how much to drink is what it does. And it's GX, so it's Gatorade with a formulation matched to your body chemistry. That's the idea, sort of personalized electrolyte level. And that was pretty good, so we did that. They provide some funding, got a company started, built out a manufacturing infrastructure, and did that, and then worked with all these really cool celebrity athletes in the Gatorade portfolio, Serena Williams and Jason Tatum and Paul George. And this was the big one. This is Lionel Messi. This is right after the World Cup, so this was like a blowout commercial. I think he has more followers on social media than anyone on the planet. That's what I'm told anyway. It sounds reasonable. Anyway, there's the device. So if you want to be cool like Lionel Messi, you got to get a GX patch, put it on, take a picture, and do the thing. So you can pick these up at any Dick's Sporting Goods store. So we've done about 3 million devices to this point, and a good way to get the company started, I guess. But it's not a toy, it's scientifically validated, and so we look at correlations, colorimetric, HPLC on chloride and sweat loss versus absorbent pad and that kind of thing. So it's a good way to kind of get the company started. But I think we're more interested in medical or medically related, applications. And so the company Epicor Biosystems has partnerships with Chevron and BP, Fluor, a number of different construction and oil and gas entities, and thinking about hydration in the context of worker safety. And so here, because of the PPE, you can't do colorimetrics. We have a little Bluetooth module. You snap it on, and it does the readout and then transmits to the phone base station. You track temperature, activity, electrolyte loss, and water loss, that type of thing. But let me just conclude. I think I'm out of time, basically, but back to medical. And so I mentioned that cystic fibrosis screening diagnostics are based on chloride measurements associated with sweat. Now, I didn't know that, but we were contacted by pediatricians who are aware of the GX patch. They said, hey, can you use that for screening pediatric patients? And we said, yeah, why not? Why do you need it? And they said the reason why they need it is the standard way to do that test involves this kind of like hockey puck rigid type of thing. It's basically a canister that houses a coiled up tube, and you strap it onto the arm of the infant induce the sweating, and then the sweat fills up the tube. You pop the container open, you pull the tube out, and then you transfer sweat from that tube to a chloridimeter. It's a desktop analytical instrument in a hospital setting, get the chloride concentration out. The problem is kids hate this because you have to strap it on pretty tight to avoid leakage. Even when you do that, they have about a 25% failure rate associated with inadequate sweat collected, because you have to get it in the tube, and you have to get it out of the tube, and then you have to have a technician. It has to be done in a hospital. So the idea was like replace all that just with a soft sticker with the colorimetrics built in. You don't need to pull the sweat out, so you can do the assay with a very tiny volume, but microliter is really all that's needed. And then you just do the assay and the development of the chloride assessment right on the baby in that way. So we're pretty excited about it. This is kind of our Northwestern logo. This guy, it's not clear that he's convinced, but it's fun to work with these kids and sort of do side to side comparisons. And one of the interesting insights that comes out of this is kids are great because they're totally uninhibited in terms of their feedback that you get. And so we initially showed up with just white devices, with the fluid channels and everything, totally not interested. I don't know if you can see this, but we decided to put some cartoon logos. So this is Lightning McQueen from Cars, and then they can't get enough of them. Like tons of these devices. So I think probably adults have similar thoughts. Anything that goes on the body, you're kind of aware of the appearance, and it was interesting to get that kind of feedback. Anyway, that all aligns with clinical standards. I won't go through the details there. So I think we, like Joe and like Patrick and like others here, very interested in sweat for other kinds of measurements as well. We kind of think about nutritional biomarkers, especially in the context of pediatric patients. There's a lot of nutritional information in sweat, turns out. There's vitamin C, so we have a colorimetric indicator for vitamin C. You can do calcium, zinc. You can do iron. Now, the big question is, who cares about sweat? You really care about blood chemistry. And so you have to do the correlation studies. They're kind of in the middle of that. And some cases they correlate, some cases they don't. You have to kind of figure it out. It's based on human physiology, hard to predict that. But in this particular case, we measure the sweat composition before and after taking like a vitamin tablet. And so you're spiking it, and you can look at the peak and look at the decay and compare that to previous studies on serum and begin to see that. But the nice thing about this colorimetrics and microfluidics is easy to multiplex. So you can do large numbers of different assays in these kind of devices and read it out all at once. And you can also just leverage everything that's been developed by the lab on a chip community over the last 20, 30 years and immediately port it into these devices. So these little valves here, just little passive valves, allow for sequential filling of these reservoirs. So you can get kind of a time dependent measurement of these various sweat biomarkers without electronic timers and things like that, and you have channels like that. Anyway, that's all I wanted to share with you. I think it went a little bit over, but not too bad, hopefully. Anyway, it's sort of electronics, microfluidics, skin interface stuff, academic science to commercial products, I guess, is where our focus really is these days, more and more maybe. But I want to conclude by acknowledging senior collaborators, engineering science, clinical medicine, sports has been fun as well. Lindsay Baker at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, pretty interesting collection of folks there studying sweat, acknowledge them. But the students and the postdocs do all the work, so I always conclude by acknowledging them for their great ideas and their persistence and their hard work. So thanks to them, thanks to you. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any.